Hi, everyone. I'm going to start as I know we're running late, and as per usual, everyone has got many different versions of places to get to later on this evening or from whatever time zone you're joining us. My name is Amelia Doncourt, and I was the project lead for Duende, Don't They? And this project has been a consideration of who gets to make art, how and why, and how our collective struggle and creation can contribute to feminist, anti-racist world making. And whilst working on Duende, we've been considering care as methodology, which is fed into each chapter, iteration and conversation. And so it's with care that I welcome you today and my lovely panelists, of which it looks like many of us are called Edward. That's not actually the case. There's one Edward, he, him, in the red. You also made a great choice there, Edward, in the red, and that is the real Edward. And then Amelia here and Rachel at the bottom, and I'll be sharing all of our bios in a moment. But just to clear up any confusion with that, it didn't help that the three of us also all chose purple, but there's some kind of synergy going on there as well. So I will let you know a bit about myself very briefly. I'll try not to talk too much. So I am an actor, writer and facilitator, and I work across theatre and television, as well as leading corporate training and workshops around diversity, equity and inclusion. And I suppose I just like to talk, think and dream about racial justice and gender consciousness. And I see my friend Jess smiling there because we talk about dreaming a lot. I'm currently studying for MA in gender, culture and media at Goldsmiths. And the biggest part of all of the various things I do in my work world is storytelling. I co-created and performed Duende. Today we've also got the real Edward Adam Tang. Edward is currently studying an MSc in political thought at SOAS. His work focuses on the cultivation of revolutionary humanist anti-colonialist thought practice and the commitment towards building a praxis for decolonisation in the 21st century. Outside of academia, Edward is a horticulturist, poet, writer and part-time curator, and Edward was an audience member at Duende. We also have Rachel / Edward, Rachel Valentine-Smith, who is a director, artist and facilitator working across the UK and internationally. She works as associate artist at Clean Break, as well as studying for an MA in art and politics at Goldsmiths. Rachel was co-artistic director of the Faction Ensemble for 6 years and directed work commissioned by New Diorama Theatre, Stephen Joseph Theatre, the Lowry and the British Council. And Rachel co-created and directed Duende. And last, but by no means least, Jess, who has a very clear name there. Thank you so much, Jess. Jess is an anti-racism educator, writer, speaker, podcast host, creative and events producer. Jess is the co-founder of Beloved Agency, a DEI consultancy, and she also works as a writer for various publications. She consults, produces events, workshops, and co-hosts the Third Way podcast. Jess created and facilitated the care space at Duende. So to get us in the mood, I'm going to reshare the trailer of Duende. Now, we haven't had the test of this, and anyone who knows me knows notoriously that I am terrible at tech. So we'll see how this goes. Everyone just cross your fingers. I think I've set this up well, but we're just going to see. And if it goes wrong, never mind, because then that's all the joy of play and creation, which is a little bit about this panel anyway. So let's have a go. Oh no, hang on, let me stop that. Wait 1 second. Yeah, it's kind of a comedy thing too, so don't worry. Sound, title video.
As much Duende.
So I feel like that actually worked. No one's come and said it didn't, so hurrah. And that was just a little opportunity for those of you who didn't get to see the project that we shared earlier in the spring, to get a bit of a sense of what the piece was. And I know this is a slightly odd panel today, because we're talking about something that many of you might not have seen or been a part of, but really we want to consider, I guess, the value of art right now, particularly in terms of anti-racism, feminism, and we've been very much looking at a methodology of care, which we'll talk a bit more about shortly. But I'll give you a very brief bit of background on Duende. So it was a theatre project originally imagined by myself and Rachel, who's now called Rachel, so I'm the only one who's now lying and calling myself Edward. And according to Angela Davis, art is a social consciousness that has the potential to influence feelings as well as knowledge. And it feels that access to art is crucial now more than ever in the UK, where I'm based. We're currently seeing arts and humanities courses being cut, except for the privileged few. So we, in making this project, and very much the part of the context of us talking right now, is about us working in a challenging physical and political project towards accessing the arts more freely. A Duende was a response to a Lorca essay about duende, which is a Spanish word. It doesn't have an English translation, but I think about it as the magic or the burn of art. And our piece acted as a prompt to question how the specificities of one's body, ethnicity, background, sexuality affects engagement with art, and how we position making and creating as a political act. So there's a brief background, and I'm going to start drawing in my friends and panelists now. So Jess, I'm going to start with you. You, as many of us, are a multi-hyphenated professional and you work across lots of different areas. So I wanted to ask originally, what was it that brought you to the Duende project, apart from the fact that I asked you?
I was going to say you.
Yeah.
I think what really pulled me in was a couple of things. So having a bit of a background in the sort of performing arts theater world myself, that felt interesting to me, to take this work of anti-racism, this work of trying to find ways to create equity and try to find, really ways to bring what I would term liberation into the spaces we move in, and bringing that into the arts and into that space, and bringing those two worlds together for me, but not just because of me personally, but because I think, and you quoted Angela Davis, because there is so much power in how we craft art, how we use art, how art can, touch us in ways that is just different to other mechanisms. And one of the things I always ask myself, and we talk about a lot, is how can we enroll a critical mass of people into some of these ideas, into these concepts, into a real drive and care, into making a difference, and then introducing care, which for me, as someone who would consider themselves as or as someone striving towards a Black feminist, Black queer feminist person in terms of my approach, in terms of my work, care is really the thing that, in my view, is going to set us apart, where what we're sowing into today is going to show up in the future that we're trying to build. And so once you said care, I was like, well, I can't not be involved now. So that was kind of my journey into the project.
Thanks so much, Jess, and thanks for introducing this concept of care. And it feels that it's something I often, as someone who works in theatre, think it's an industry that talks about a lot of values but is quite valueless. And care is something that I'm beginning to want to sow into my work in more and more ways. And this felt like a very exciting opportunity for us to really consider what a methodology of care might look like from the very beginning. And Rachel, I'd love to bring you into the conversation as really the instigator, actually, for me, of the reason why I wanted to play with care in this was when we first looked at the project in autumn. Rachel had said to me, do you think we need a care space afterwards? And I said, yeah, I think we do, but there isn't scope for that. So I wanted to ask Rachel, what did bringing a pedagogy of care into this space, what came up for you, and what did it mean to you?
Thanks, Amelia. Thanks for the question, and it's nice to see everybody. Yeah, it's a good question, and I guess for me, like thinking about this word care, which continues to evolve through our practice and our experiences together, and especially being in a brilliant space facilitated by Jess, is really about the specifics of care and how it's contextual and it's not a one size fits all, which sort of then goes to the first part of your question about, or your point about how I asked when we originally did it in autumn, do we want to talk about care space? And a lot of that is about our social positions in the world, especially with so many dominant structures centered around white supremacy and inequality for so many people. And also in terms of what Jess was talking about, in terms of how people who are of marginalized identities are not given space and voice in a way that means that they have the opportunity to talk about their experiences, let alone have those experiences valued and respected. And so care is becoming both more specific and bigger for me, like day by day. But central to all of it is about community, and it is about that thing Jess was talking about modeling the world we want to be in through making theatre, which, as you've said, Amelia, is like quite a big ask, because it's an industry that needs a lot of work for that to be a sort of first-hand practice at the moment. And it's interesting as well, because when we were making the show, I remember we were looking at Basquiat, and we were looking at other artists, and we were looking at what the text was telling us, and how there's a narrative about to be an artist that somehow means that you are meant to suffer. And we really wanted to turn that on its head through our, and through your in particular, your lens of being an artist in this world. I don't know if that answered the question, but I've said some words, so hopefully that's something to move us along.
Rachel, I like those words, and let's be honest, this panel is very much going to be about saying some words, and it doesn't really matter about answering the question, but I just really want to hear all the words. And it really sat with me then, you talking about this kind of this idea around the artist who kind of ruins themselves for the art, and this idea of suffering, but really, who has the privilege to suffer for their art? In these violent dominant structures, who has the potential to do that? Who has the wealth? Who has the support in any number of ways? And I think us looking at care in the way we did it felt full-bodied, because it was about before the show, it was about the thing that we offered, but then it was also about this piece afterwards. So I remember when I started thinking about this and thinking about what I wanted to do for the Worldmaking Beyond SOAS initiative, I was thinking about this, a place for care when letting comes down. When we on Twitter and in various different places, we kind of see trigger warnings, and this thing might affect you, but then we don't show aftercare. And so this project very much was looking at what aftercare might be, but also in a really full-bodied way that meant that care, it was a loving space, and bell hooks allows me to say love in academia as much as I want. So it was a place that was really full of love, of challenge, but of love and care. And at this point, we have, as three of the people who kind of conceived what it would be, have spoken a lot, but I'd really like to bring in Edward, who came to see one of the performances and shared in the care space. And I'd really like to hear from you, Edward, about really just what the experience was for you of both watching the performance, but then this aftercare thing that we're talking about. But how was it for you?
No, thank you so much, Amelia, and I'm glad you finally got your name back on the Zoom. I'd like to kind of quickly quote Suzanne Césaire, especially as we begin to kind of talk about Black feminism. In one of her essays, she kind of reflects on the Martinican people. And she says like who over the centuries adapted themselves to this land, and they're only now beginning to produce authentic works of art. And she, you know, the questions asked are, why is this the case? And, you know, whilst we, to some extent, we know the answers to that, the question she follows up with is, what is the Martinican fundamentally, intimately, and unilaterally, and how do they live? And, you know, she kind of goes on to say that we start to see, especially when we express and when we make art, we see a stunning contradiction appear between the innermost self with its desires, its impulses, and its unconscious forces. You know, and ultimately she concludes saying, you know, one must be prepared to cannibalize themselves. And I think being within the experience of Duende, you know, and that's how I contributed at the end. It definitely felt like things were unraveling, but looking at the act of cannibalizing self and unraveling, these are often words that we quite look at in a very negative way. And you know, at the performance, we were able to kind of, I think the crowd, we reached a consensus saying that who gets to decide if unraveling is bad, you know? And in some ways, I think firstly, I'm really amazed at the sustainability of things, in the sense where, you know, Suzanne Césaire poses that question, but here we are, decades on, us, you know, still carrying on that question and still kind of like, in some ways, it's very poetic, literally playing it out. And so for me, being within the space and then within inside the care space, it was overwhelming, but not in a way that, like I'm saying, it's not a negative way. It was a lot for me. It caused me to question a lot around me. And even the way that you have an orthodox theatrical experience, it wasn't in a vast room with all these different peoples and different sets. And it was literally a very intimate, small space. The lighting was amazing, by the way. And it was a journey. And this was a very unorthodox journey, but it was a journey nonetheless. And so when it comes back to that question of who makes art, who gets to make it, I think it reaffirms the fact that it's a very human thing. But that's kind of what I took away from the experience.
Thanks, Edward. And it's a really interesting suggestion there around this notion of you were talking about cannibalization, but also about who decides kind of the right and the wrong, or the good and the bad. And I think something that came up quite a lot in the care spaces was this notion of being able to be messy, of what an unraveling might be. And it's probably another slightly overused term, but a safe space to unravel. So we created those bonds, this intimate space where we could actually reflect, evaluate, pour out, unravel, go in and go out and share with one another in a way that a dominant idea of a theatrical space would not. You know, we don't tend to go to the National Theatre and then sit afterwards and speak to the person next to you, and then the person 5 rows in front, or indeed the person who sat right at the front and had the best seats when you were right at the back and had I was going to say £5, but let's be honest, there aren't £5 tickets anymore. So whatever the worst seats are, they're still probably £25, because, you know, you've really got to pay to sit in a bad seat now. So, you know, how do we unravel? And the care space felt a bit like a space of unraveling. And I want to come back to Rachel and Jess, if you have any thoughts about that, in terms of this notion of us realigning, really, therefore, how we make art, and how we are in dialogue with those people who watch it, and then also in some way become makers. I know that Edward and other audience members made posters and signs and shared words, and suddenly there was this sense of us all producing, of us all creating, and not in this kind of capitalist productivity efficiency way, but in a way that was messy and unraveling. And what thoughts that Jess and Rachel, you have around that, the power of making, and what that could look like in a new liberatory framework?
Yeah. I think one thing that really stood out to me when Edward said it felt like a journey, an unorthodox journey, but it felt like a journey. And I got really excited because, you know, you'll remember one of the conversations we had when we talked about creating it all. Like, one of the first things I said to you on the phone, Amelia, when we talked about it was, I wanted to be a journey. We didn't want it to be a sort of, you arrive, now you're watching a thing, and now you're in the care space. But we wanted this pedagogy of care to be from the moment you walk through the doors of the venue, to finding your seat, to engaging with others, to engaging in the performance. Like, we even, you know, for those who weren't there, we had a few moments within the performance where audience was invited to engage, and then sort of transitioned into that care space. And I think this idea of journey, and of not so much of sort of moving away from seeing art as a someone over here tells someone over there what to see, think, feel, right? Which is what art has become in capitalism, right? It's become this, like, it's a tool in order to do a thing. But actually coming back to this idea of art as a dialogue, and as an exploring, and as a way of dreaming and imagining. Because I think, you know, we talk about this in through the lens of a Black feminist lens, an anti-racist lens. That's all of that is about better futures and different futures. All of that is about dismantling what is and building something new. And introducing care into art in this way, as we attempted to do in Duende, to me is very much about, you know, it's almost a bit spiritual. I don't know if you're allowed to say that in an academic context, but it's about pulling this thing out of all of us that is required to building something new. And it's going to need all of us to engage. That's the basis of what we talk about when we talk about Black feminism. It's the basis of what it's going to need all of us. And I think art and care in art can create these containers, these frameworks where we can pull that out and be in dialogue with one another. And so I think that's really what it means to me, and why I think it's so incredibly important for our movements, right? To include this practice in all its different iterations, and we just made an attempt at it, but to include this practice in how we build our movements.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. And I just wanted to quickly add that at the beginning of this, the conference started earlier today, and in Awino Okech, in her introduction to the conference, she spoke about the university academia being a microcosm of wider society, and it just struck me as we're here kind of saying, oh, well, I mustn't say this within academia, or I mustn't. And actually, part of this notion of unraveling and a kind of a reimagining of what integration and collaboration looks like is about us changing the rules of what I can and can't say. And so if this is the microcosm of wider society, actually perhaps these are the conversations that we should and can be having more and more. And I found that when I had the opportunity to speak to other project leads on the Worldmaking Beyond SOAS initiative this year, there was lots of conversation about play, something that came up a lot with us, around care, around joy, things that possibly within the microcosm haven't been as alive, and suddenly are really kind of coming to the front. And so actually this thing of, we talk about a lot about kind of transnational solidarity and interdisciplinary solidarity, but there's also a thing around linguistics, around the words that we're using and the places that we're using them, and how we begin to just let them fly into other spaces, whether this be virtual here, but across the different domains of our lives. And for many of us who are working across lots of different spaces, how do we stop apologizing for saying, oh, well, someone gave me permission to say love, so I'll say it now. And, oh, well, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to. Oh, well, I'm at a theatre, so it's not appropriate for me to speak to this person. How do we begin to say, actually, I will? And I think a part of this project has been a bit about us not asking permission or apologising. And you very much reminded me of that then, Jess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it asks all the questions, right, of who even created that space in which we feel like we can't say this. Which is, you know, one of the big questions that we asked in Duende is who even created this measurement, this whole measuring tape of who is allowed to make art and who makes good art and what makes good art. And so it kind of just goes full circle again. Yeah. We'll talk about all the spirituality and all the play.
Yeah, let's pour it all in. It's all valid, which is as another line I think that came up in one of the care spaces, that it's all welcome. Rachel, I saw that you unmuted, and I'd love to get your thoughts on some of the things that we've been saying.
Yeah, I mean, actually, funny enough, you really echoed a thought I had as Jess was talking about the idea of permission. And I just want to say I fully advocate for more feelings, more love, and more spirituality in academia, because that could really start to move things in a different direction. And it's also made me think about part of that structure of academia and the student teacher being such a prominent transaction in that, and especially now as universities are businesses first and education second, and actually that reflecting in those things that Jess was saying about art capitalism, and certainly at the theatre, the transaction between the work and the audience is very binary. It is, here, I present this thing to you, you will clap at the end, and then you'll go and tell everyone that you saw this show, and that will give you cultural value, or it will make you feel validated about XYZ. And so, yeah, the afterness of what happens next, what happens after that point, was a big part of our conversations about this care space. And without, at the risk of repeating myself, that sort of feeds into something I was talking about earlier in terms of the definitions of care. And what I was really enchanted by with Jess's care space was actually made me think about how care can mean kindness, it can mean compassion, and it can certainly mean love, but it's not necessarily about being nice. It can be, but it's also about like what does care look like if you are in a space where we have offered a piece of work and it's bringing up these questions. Not only what does it look like to check in and talk about people's experiences, but what Jess did so brilliantly was then also say, offer that moment of interaction, that unraveling, that also then turned into, and what's the action we're going to do, what's next, which I think was really important, that sort of the activism of it. And I say that with a small a, because, you know, I'm going to apologize for a word I've used now as well, yeah, and so those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, care as challenge, and how we mediate the space between, you know, in many ways. I think people could listen to us and kind of say we can't have care as everything, and I would almost argue that you can, that if it's embedded in the right way, how can we let care infiltrate in many modes of operation, in the way that we're working with other people, in the way that we're sharing, that isn't necessarily just about being kind, as you say, even though kindness is great, but also allows for the unraveling, the messy, the challenge, and all of those things in between. Edward, I'd love to come back to you and ask a bit more about, as someone who is studying at SOAS right now, but also have lots of different things going on, about where the space for this notion of care, how it might infiltrate the work that you're doing right now. I know that myself, Jess, and Rachel have now apologized many times for talking about love or spirituality, and I wonder what any of those, and we'll take it all back, we can say it all, but I wonder, I'm thinking through this pedagogy of care in the work that you're doing right now, how it might affect or infiltrate the way that you're approaching things.
That's a really good question. I think for me personally, how it's definitely infiltrated being in the academic space. I think if I could share a small anecdote, being at SOAS is a really internationalist, if we can use that word, university. I'm from London, you know, but I think, you know, a lot of the times I feel like a tourist in my own city. And, you know, coming to SOAS initially, like, and being one of the youngest people in my department, I was like, what am I doing? You know, and, you know, we have all these grandiose questions and theories that we're thinking about in class. I remember this one time when we were, I was chosen me and my classmate Keely, we were chosen to look at Sylvia Winter. And Sylvia Winter's amazing, you know, the way she writes and the Arabic, she's a bit hard to get into at first. It was a very hard read, but it also left me with a lot of foundations. And I remember having to present Sylvia Winter to the rest of the class. And, you know, before I got up, you know, a really, really good friend of mine, Marquise, he also does political thought with me. He was like, yo, bro, don't even worry about how you say it or how you present it, because we're here to kind of go through the question together. You know, and I needed that, because I think, you know, like we've rightly kind of discussed in the session so far, the like marketization of education, especially in the UK, like everything's competition. And so to be in such a, what could often be seen as a competitive space, especially at such a level in higher education, to have a classmate, you know, come to me and be like, yo, bro, it's okay. That was really touching for me. And it reminded me, it reaffirmed the human element to the praxis, if that makes sense. You know, why we do these things, why we answer these questions, why we think, why we express, you know. And, you know, other examples I can give, you know, we might have a situation where there's an essay that we might have to do. And, you know, like your lecturer or someone might grade you quite poorly. And it's understandable to see how different staff members, based on their own perspectives and experiences, won't oftentimes be able to relate with students. But, you know, being able to lament that across the board to the rest of the class, and, you know, people are often asked to review, peer review, assess, look at, can I get a PDF? Could I reference you here? And so for me, having that has really made me double back and ask the question, what is the role of the intellectual, especially when it's taken away from panel discussions? And obviously, no disrespect to this one, but, you know, coming out of that world of like panel discussions and lectures and seminars, but becoming really horizontal with the spaces that we're in, and exercising that form of care. And there's a really interesting PDF I'd love to kind of share with the audience and even send it to you guys afterwards, where this woman, Ipadisola, she talks about care epistemology. And I'm gonna send it for him, but just the things that she recommends in order to be able to tackle epistemic challenges upon colonized peoples. It's amazing, because it isn't just, it's very heavy on, okay, here's the tangible things that we can do to create this. And so, yeah, in short, being able to come into a space where you think it's very cold and being exposed to such warmth, it definitely changed a lot for me personally.
Thanks, Edward. And I think those questions around what is the role of the intellectual are very similar to what is the role of the artist, and within the structures that we have to engage with that, with the job ultimately. So when we're talking about capitalism, we're thinking about these things as a job, and how we make it through. And actually, I really appreciate the thing you said about, you know, away from being on a panel, and even this panel now, I thought, oh, I was worried, oh, the other panels will be very academic, and whenever I chair a panel, and particularly because it's my own project, it's always much more chatty, and really I just want to hear what people think and feel, and really want to then listen to other people. And this is a good moment to say, we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes, but if anyone does have any questions, we'll have a few minutes for questions at the end, and they can be far-reaching, weird and wonderful questions around anything that's come up here around care, art, capitalism, and the ways that we can co-create, the ways that we can begin to eschew some of these kind of straitjacketed ideas that suggest that we have to approach the work in a certain way, and which Edward so beautifully highlighted then around being in academia and thinking about this idea of competition always having, which is very similar within the arts, but actually how we let go of that. And care can be a really beautiful way for us to support one another in the wider tapestry of society. I know Rachel has to leave shortly, and so I just want to come to you before I do final takeaways from everyone else, and before we go to any questions, just to really ask what your biggest takeaway has been from this project, Rachel, and where you think, and this is a huge and where you think it could go next. And I don't mean the Duende project itself, but I suppose really how care might feed into your future work, and what that could look like in terms of this big project of anti-racist feminist world making.
Yeah, thanks, Amelia, and I'm sorry I do have to shoot off very shortly. I just guess that it's something that is like a lot of the work that is to be done, a continual process. It's not an end point. It's a journey, Jess. For me, like my main practice is as a director, which means I am often responsible for a space, and a space that convenes many artists together. And traditionally that is a position of power, and really for me power has come to mean responsibility and not control. And that responsibility really comes down to care, and working a lot in educational environments, certainly drama schools, sort of prioritizing that and knowing that if everybody feels that their needs are met, or at least acknowledged to start with, that then we're all starting from a place to do our best work. And by best, I don't, that means like feeling fulfilled, that means finding joy in the work, that means not obsessing over the product, and like really seeing capitalism as a fact of life and a mentality, and looking for all of the details where that creeps in, and sort of resisting that in whatever space I can, bit by bit. But also sometimes that means that I need to hold my hand up and say I need rest, or hold my hand up and say I got this wrong, and be brave about both of those things. And my final takeaway is that, like, let's just do Duende forever. If anybody wants to fund that forever project, that's great, thanks.
Duende forever is always a great takeaway. I love that. At the end of the project, we did a silly little hashtag of make Duende, but this idea of continuing the conversation, continuing this proffer of us all making art together, and I think really that feels like the bones of why Duende felt like a really exciting project, because it wasn't simply this binary of I offer you this and then you take away and we both leave, but was this idea was an exchange. And what is it for us to make and exchange art in that way, and what could that look like in the future? Rachel, please obviously feel free to go in meeting. Thank you so much.
Brilliant.
For
Have
sharing
a great evening.
your thoughts. Thanks, Rachel.
Bye.
And Rachel's kind of reignited this idea of the work, and I use that as a very kind of loose term, but being foregrounded with care. And I think very much about the book Care Work by Leah Lakshmi, of this around intimacy care. When we begin to think about care foregrounded in the work we're doing, we begin to think about people who are beyond just the things that we know. We begin to ask questions about the things that aren't simply situated in our lived experience. And I know when working with Jess around what the care space would be, we had lots of toing and froing around, well, we want to give people lots of information because that feels caring. And then, but is that caring for everyone? Because is too much information going to be overwhelming for other people? And so this idea of dialogue and being able to kind of work through the conversations, but knowing that the project is foregrounded and that feels and felt very important. So Jess, I'm going to come to you with the same thing that I asked Rachel, really, which is, your biggest takeaways from this project, and how care might affect your future work across all the different things that you do.
Yeah, I think my biggest takeaway actually was something that in some ways had nothing to do with what we were trying to create, and yet had everything to do with what we were trying to create. If I share a personal, just to illustrate it, share a personal anecdote. So I have fibromyalgia, which is a chronic pain illness. And around the time of Duende, I had a really bad flare-up, sometimes come for whatever reason. And what was really interesting to observe in myself, and Rachel was referencing this, how do we not just think of capitalism as this big thing out there, but how do we recognize the patterns, the behaviors, the things that have crept into all of us because of the world that we live in. And what was really interesting to observe, and in some ways, and that was my biggest takeaway, was that when I had a flare up around the time, there was such a resistance in me to say, I need to stop and I need to care for myself so I can create this care space. And it was, I kind of laugh about it now, but it was actually quite dramatic. Like, I think there were tears at one point. Like, it was because there was this wrestle in me of, but I'm here to do a job and be productive. I'm supposed to be productive in creating care whilst I'm going through that thing. And I mention it because I think the biggest takeaway for me was receiving the care from all of you, even though my job was care. But then also this reminder of, or this intersection of all of this conversation with how am I actually living into that, right? So we can, to Edward's point, we can have all these conversations, panel discussions, be really intellectual about what care means in the Black feminist anti-racist framework, and we can use all the big words, and you all have way more big words than I do. But what does it actually mean when I come off of here and when I'm in a place, as I was in that context, where I'm not well and I'm trying to create a care space? How do I actually unravel that within myself, to come full circle to what I was saying in the context of unraveling? And how do I actually live into this care that I want the future to be? Like, I want the future to be a care space. I want the world we live in to be a care space. Do I live into that? And do I wrestle with that? Do I unravel that? And I think that embodied experience, right? It was an embodied experience of everything we were talking about. I was experiencing it then and there with the flare up and the need for rest and care for myself. So I think that's the one thing, and like that continuing that journey within myself and inviting others into it. How do we live into this? How do we live into this? And within that, hold ourselves accountable when we don't, which we all don't all the time, because we live in the world we live in and we're indoctrinated in the way we are. So I think that was my biggest takeaway, and that's what will continue to show up as well. Kind of answers both questions. How I continue to come back and pause and ask myself, how are you living into this? How's care showing up for self and my community and everything that I'm in? Because again, as I said at the beginning, I think all of this imagining, all of this future that we want to create, we've got to live into it now. We've got to sow it now. That's all I'm going to say.
A really beautiful example of care as challenge as well. That the struggle, and struggle was a word that came up a lot, particularly with Angela Davis's writing, and then a word that we really worked with a lot in creating Duende, that the struggle of showing care, of embodying care within our own practice and experience. And often that can work against the thing that we're doing. I've said that my product will be this, therefore how can I show care to myself because I've said that I will do that? And I had another conversation with the Nest Collective about their project on Worldmaking Beyond SOAS, about talking about Black diasporic voices, but also recognizing an artists who are making lots of things, and yet the need for rest. And of course, rest and care can be, so not necessarily always, but can be really co-constituted. And Edward, I'll come to you with the same question, really about a takeaway. And you spoke a bit about how you're, I guess, experiencing care within academia right now, but really anything around your biggest takeaway from being a contributor to our care space, and what's next with that?
My biggest takeaway, it would definitely be and it's funny how all these things kind of align, because I've been reading Suzanne Césaire a lot recently. So having read that, and then to see what essentially her successors have put together in the 21st century context, my biggest takeaway would definitely be that there's still a lot of work to do. But seeing things that have often just been postulations play out like in reality in front of, in front of me, but not even in ways that I hadn't even begun to think of. It makes me really hopeful for the future, but also for the present that we exist in right now. And in terms of what next, like Rachel said, like any way that this can be like a forever thing, maybe we can swap it out, do like seasonal breaks and stuff, do it in other countries. Because when I look at the premise of Duende, this could easily be replicated in so many different ways. And I think that's the simplicity of it all is what makes it, and I keep using the word human, but that's what makes it the most human for me, because it was so simple. And it's almost as if, how do people miss the mark with making these things happen? When we look at theater, when we look at art, how do we miss the mark? Why do we bother with adding so much complexities and boxes and like, why? So that'll be my biggest takeaway, if that made sense. Yeah.
It did, Edward, and I'll share my takeaway as well. And in this moment that I do, if anyone does have any questions or thoughts that they'd like to share, please do pop that in the message, the chat box. Is that what they're called? Let's go with that, in the chat box. People know what I mean. If you do, pop that in there. But just listening to everyone else share their takeaways, it really, I guess, solidified for me this idea that my biggest takeaway is a sense of continuity, of growth, of the sprawling nature of both care and the way that we are approaching this type of theatre making, creating, feminist, anti-racist praxis in life, practicing what we're doing, and that it's beyond this idea of standing on a stage and pouring out to someone, but really, as Edward was saying, then finding a level of simplicity to, what is it for us just to say, here is a space for us to talk about our feelings in a caring way. And I'm thinking about the Public Feelings Project in Chicago, and there are lots of iterations of this that have happened globally, and they are all very simple things. And so how might we feed in this concept of a care space? And I must at this point just say that for me, a care space, that idea very much came from a great teacher and friend of mine, Dr. Akanksha Mehta at Goldsmiths, who really sewed into my heart the concept of a care space in my first year at Goldsmiths, and offered me that simplicity of saying, it's a space where we care for one another, that might not always be easy, but is accessible, and is a way for us to talk about feelings in a way that you possibly didn't know that you could or should. And so I offer that to the audience in the room right now, of where might you want to share a care space, or how might that work, or what could that look like, with great simplicity, that isn't about a kind of highfalutin language, or even a kind of a complex preparation, but really is about listening and sharing and being agile on the journey. And this concept of journey that Jess shared when we first spoke about this project, and also is something else that Awinogo Ketch has spoken about in terms of journey and movement, in terms of our kind of liberatory worldview. So journey, continuation, and really just an offer to us all of how we might want to really consider a pedagogy of care within our day-to-day world for ourselves and within community, and what might that look like, and what might that feel like. So I can't see anything has come up in terms of questions. I'll just, if there is anything that anyone would like to pop in, please do. But in that moment, I'd just like to say thank you so much to Worldmaking Beyond SOAS for giving us the opportunity to to work on the Duende project with this methodology of care. Thank you to Jess for being involved. Thank you to Rachel. Thank you to Edward for showing up today and for being someone who has become now part of this my tapestry of care and creation. And I'm sure now we will find ways, after meeting you at this project, find ways to work together. And that's really exciting. And I hope that we will make Duende, and the other people watching now will also find ways for them to create and really insert and live this idea of care with the work that we're doing right now. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference tomorrow. For now, bye.
Thanks for having us. Bye.